Hey folks, a lot of people have wondered why it is I'm so opposed to economic libertarianism. They've said, Caleb, libertarianism, it's a political theory. They just want more freedom. They want the government to be less involved in our lives. A lot of young people are into libertarianism because, they want more freedom. Well, I maintain that libertarianism is very dangerous. And I'm not talking, libertarians, they've got all kinds of books about the ideal free market capitalist world, but let's talk about what the libertarian movement has created. What kind of policies have been enacted by the libertarian movement? Basically, the policies that come from libertarianism are based on the principle that somehow we can cut our way into economic growth. That's a complete myth. You cannot cut your way into economic growth. Cutting government spending does not lead to growth. Let me explain. So basically, the premise of the libertarians is that, hey, if we just cut the jobs of government workers, cut government subsidies, cut social programs, the result is everyone will have more spending money, and they'll spend more money and we'll have economic growth, more people will start their own businesses, etc. Well, that is a fallacious concept. I mean, you might as well ask, the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy to come rescue the economy, because that is just not what happens. When you cut public spending, when you cut the jobs of government workers, when you cut social programs like food stamps, when you cut government subsidies and government aid, the result is all the people that benefited from that, all those government workers, all those people getting food stamps, all those people, getting some kind of subsidy or assistance, they all are less able to spend than they were before, right? Those government workers don't have jobs, so they're not spending as much money, they're getting unemployment, or maybe they're trying to get a job that pays less, or they're unemployed, or whatever. They're not spending as much money. With food stamps, you're not selling as many agricultural products. They're not spending that. You go down the line. So you cut government spending. All these people are spending less. And then they say, well, everyone's taxes, in theory, are going to go down as a result of these cuts, and so people are going to spend more. No, not exactly. Here's the problem with that, is that people like you and me, yes, if we have bigger incomes, we spend more. However, those with billions and billions of dollars, the elite, the folks who pay very, very high tax rates, except they don't pay very, very high tax rates now. They've all found ways to weasel out of it. But the ones who are supposed to pay very, very high tax rates, they spend money in order to live, but mostly they have so much money that they tend to invest their money only when they can see a return on their investment. Those with billions and billions of dollars, millionaires, billionaires, they tend to invest when they can get a return on their investment, when they can make more money. However, when you take all the spending power out of the economy, when you cut all this public spending, all these people are not spending money, so the economy goes down. So those with billions and billions of dollars, they don't invest it because they are not going to see a return on their investment. So at the end of the day, things get worse. And we've seen these policies play out, and libertarians, they live in this kind of alternate universe. A lot of libertarians will talk about the Chilean economic miracle. That's a very common belief among libertarians, that, oh my God, Milton Friedman and his policies were enacted in Chile in the 1970s, and it created an economic miracle. Well, let's back up and talk about what happened in Chile in the 1970s. 1973, Chile had a socialist president, Salvador Allende. He had been elected. He had a plurality, not a majority. He was enacting some, socialistic policies, trying to move Chile toward a socialist economy and to be more friendly toward, the Soviet Union and socialist countries around the world. He was toppled in a military coup. So Augusto Pinochet came in. He became the military dictator, slaughtered 20,000 people, just a lot of atrocities. But that's not economic policy. That's just human rights. Go down the line. But anyhow, Chile, you started seeing the policies of Milton Friedman enacted. You saw a card-carrying libertarian, a guy that libertarians love, the guy who came up with monetarism, Milton Friedman. You saw his policies being enacted. The Chicago School, the Chicago boys were there. And the result was an economic disaster. We're talking between 20 and 30% unemployment. We're talking a crisis of malnutrition. There were journals, the United Nations, the World Health Organization were on the ground, and people were literally starving to death. There were children whose brains did not develop properly because they did not have food in their childhoods. It was an economic disaster. The industrial jobs had been kind of the center and the linchpin of the Chilean economy that had developed up to that point were just completely eliminated. You just saw the destruction of the Chilean middle class. It was an economic disaster. And then this economic miracle that libertarians will always cite, it happened later. It happened in 1982, almost a decade later, when the Chilean government had such an economic crisis on its hands and was facing so much internal opposition that they started nationalizing things again. They started restarting government subsidies, and then in the 80s, after a decade of disastrous economic policies as a result of libertarianism, they started moving in the other direction, and things got better. And overall, Chile never really recovered from the disaster of what happened when Milton Friedman and libertarian policies were enacted there. Now, later, you want to go into the 1990s. In the Soviet Union collapsed. You had the Communist Party forced out of power. You had a pro-U.S. president, Boris Yeltsin, and he brought in another libertarian, Jeffrey Sachs, the economist Jeffrey Sachs, and they did the same thing. They kept continuing this belief that somehow we can cut our way to economic growth. And Russia in the 1990s was an absolute disaster. The country was being looted. Thousands and thousands of factories closed their doors. You had, 20 to 30% unemployment, which is a massive level of unemployment. You had all these collective farms. The Soviet Union, they had a huge collective farm apparatus. All these collective farms shutting down and closing their doors. They're having to start importing all of their food from the United States. The steel industry shuts down, and things in Russia were an absolute disaster when they were following libertarian free market policies, and then things got better when Vladimir Putin came in, and what did he do? He oversaw the creation of two gigantic government-controlled energy corporations, Gazprom and Rosneft. So he renationalized the oil and the natural gas, created these giant state-controlled oil companies. He had written about them in his academic work as a student. He called them national champions. And that was able to reboot the Russian economy. And that's why Vladimir Putin is so popular, because he fixed up the economy after what the libertarians had done in the 1990s. You can go to Latin America during that time period. I first visited the country of Ecuador when I was 12 years old in 1999. I went to Ecuador when they had just been enacting a lot of these policies. Jeffrey Sachs was in Latin America also throughout the 1990s, and Ecuador had just switched to the dollar as their U.S. currency. They had privatized all kinds of things. They'd cut public spending. And what I saw in Ecuador in the 1990s was an economic disaster. I saw people starving on the streets. I remember when I got out of the airplane in Ecuador, we walked out onto the street in Ecuador to get a taxi, and it was like I had never seen so many crowds of desperately starving people. Well, I went back to Ecuador in 2013 after they'd elected a socialist president, Rafael Correa, who had nationalized their energy industries and was building infrastructure and was cooperating with China. It was a completely different country. He had fixed it up. They had drastically fixed up the economy. You can go down the line. Everywhere we've seen these libertarian policies enacted, it's a disaster. And if you ask libertarians about it, they always just say, that's not real libertarianism. That's not real capitalism. Libertarians have this illusion that they're somehow the underdogs, that their ideas, no one's ever really taken them seriously. They're revolutionaries. No, their ideas are probably the most influential in U.S. politics. For decades, the head of the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States was Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan was the personal friend and protege of Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand, the libertarian thinker, Atlas Shrugged, The Fountainhead, The Virtue of Selfishness, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. Alan Greenspan was her personal student, and the policies that he enacted from the Federal Reserve were policies that were dreamed up by this libertarian mindset and this belief that you can cut your way to growth. And even Alan Greenspan ultimately admitted before Congress that yes, the ideas that he devoted his entire life to, it turns out that they played a role in crashing the U.S. economy in 2007 and 2008. So libertarianism is a very dangerous concept. It's based on this illusion that you can cut your way to growth, which you cannot do. The last thing you need when the economy is not going well, when things are bad, cutting spending does not work. It is like the worst thing that you can do. It's like when there's a fire, you throw gasoline on it. That's what these libertarians believe. But they don't really believe it, and this is the important thing. They don't really believe it because they think it's economically better. Milton Friedman, Alan Greenspan, Ayn Rand, these kind of people, they're not stupid, okay? They know what the result of their policies is. They can see what happened in Russia in the 1990s. They can see what happened in Chile until the 1980s. What they really believe you can find in the writings of Ayn Rand, which is that they believe that selfishness and self-interest is the highest form of good, and that if you help anyone else, or you care for anyone else, or you have compassion, or you have government policies designed to benefit the overall community, that's immoral, and that they basically believe that human beings should not care for each other, they should not cooperate, they should not work together in groups for trying to achieve a common good. They believe in naked free market self-interest, and it's really scary. And if you read Ayn Rand's writings, her novel The Fountainhead, has a hero in it, Howard Rourke, who's a rapist. He breaks into the apartment of a woman and rapes her, and he's the hero. These are twisted, demented people. These are people that admire cruelty, they admire indifference to other people's human suffering, and they want to enact policies that kind of fit with this kind of, you could call it a mental illness, with psychopathy. And they believe that if the government just steps out of everything, that the poor people will all die and suffer, and that's okay because they're inferior, and that the rich, are just, the reason that they're rich is because they're better than everybody else, they're inherently better than everyone else, and they'll rule forever. I mean, these are demented concepts. You could really call them satanic concepts. That's what the people behind the libertarian movement believe. And the libertarian movement was set up by, the Rockefellers, the Ford Foundation, some of the most wealthy people were pushing these policies. So libertarians are not revolutionaries, and they believe in some really, really dangerous concepts. And, millions of people have died as a result of libertarian economic theories. They've died in Latin America. They've died in Russia in the 1990s. They've died all throughout the world. And Russia and China became superpowers because they had state-run economies. The reason that Russia and China have gone in the 20th century from being some of the poorest countries in the world to being what they are today, which is world industrial, economic, and military superpowers, is because they had state control of the economy. They had economies that functioned according to central planning and not profits. And that's what's being ignored. So this libertarian stuff is very, very dangerous, and it scares me to see so many young people drawn into this myth. There's nothing revolutionary about it. These are the people that have wrecked the U.S. economy, wrecked economies all over the world, and really don't care about other people, and really don't believe in compassion, and really have killed the humanity within themselves. I mean, these people have the ideology of axe murderers. Ayn Rand actually admired an axe murderer, William Hickman, when she first moved to the United States. These are demented, dangerous people who really don't care about making the world a better place.